What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? The 24 hours before my dad died, stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the ER and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of hospital COVID rules. My mother, sister and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital and going through his bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone and all our texts had not been read, not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad has been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on, why was he in the ER, etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having at the very least an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked the girl down and spoke to her, via DMS, and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. He was her high school bus driver and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died and dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a shitty secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found. I don't know how disturbing this is, it turned out pretty fantastic for one. But not for another. I was adopted, and told a silly, magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together, but their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her marrying a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went, into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings and we are all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never got to meet my mother, she died a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone. And I'm fine with that. I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life, too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled, physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory. And was raped by an orderly. And she discovered she was the result. Endings to our searching are not always happy. The reason Grandma moved away, when my dad was still a baby, to a big city, more than 3 days away from her family, was because she stabbed her stepfather and almost killed him. It was a very small village. Later she told me he was a rapist. She didn't elaborate on that and I didn't ask any follow-up questions. She ended the convo with, "I did the right thing." We never met her side of the family. She was my best friend of 7 years, we had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her, after about a year. We had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said screw it, let's go back. She's basically family. We were all so happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner, we all laughed and talked and had a blast. Best year of my life. Then slowly, she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him, she just needed a sperm donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his sperm, and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now BTW. I found out that my aunt who was 13 at the time was raped by her uncle, my great-uncle, and had a baby in a cellar in the basement of her house. The baby didn't make it, so she and her little sister buried it there. Years later, when the aunt, who had repressed those memories, had a baby, she remembered it all. When her family found out, she was labeled the slut of the family. My dad's side is garbage. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was the CEO for a major Heath fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, but that and the Heath fund role were largely built on the fraudulent qualifications and a progression of jobs also based on this claims. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting and he had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly and he ended up doing jail time. I was pretty close with my youngest uncle growing up, at least in pictures. He was in his mid-20s when I was like 5 for context. One day when I was in middle school he just stopped coming around completely. My entire family told us kids that he was backpacking around the nation. In high school I was going a genealogy project on my grandfather, his dad, and accidentally found my uncle's name on the sex offender registry. Come to find out he was running a CP ring and had served 16 years in federal prison. He's out now and my family pretends nothing happened. I stay far away. When I was 17 I dated someone who told me when he was drunk that not only would he probably hit me one day, and just wanted me to be prepared, but he also used to rape his little brother. Every now and then I remember that moment and it just floors me how dangerous that kid was. Found a scrapbook of my mom and a guy I didn't recognize from her immediately post-college days. Turns out he was a long-term boyfriend of hers who killed himself when she broke up with him. My grandfather found his body. I learned at age 20, by finding the book/shrine to him. When my grandfather passed away we discovered that he did not exist. His name was not in any government registry. He was a normal citizen, paid taxes, had a license and everything. Lived a long life, married to my grandmother for over 50 years, had multiple children, everything normal. Still to now, no one knows who he really was and why he had a false name. Hey! We're halfway through the video, thanks for watching. 96% of the people watching my videos are currently unsubscribed to my channel. You would help me out a lot. Thanks. Let's move on to the rest of the video. My mom received birthday cards with money in them for years from her parents. She kept the cards with the money in them, saving to buy a piano/sentimental reasons. My sister, who has repeatedly stolen from family members, found the collection of cards/money and took them. My mom only wanted the cards back when she realized what happened. My sister denied everything. Fuck you, Emily. While my cousin was walking around with her son in the woods, she came across a hunting stand. She climbed it, and found a pair of binoculars. Sitting straight forward, and lifting the binoculars to her eyes, she saw her own bedroom window. Let's be logical here, if it was a legit hunting stand, it was facing, and closer than 500 feet to a residence, which is illegal, which means it had to come down with prejudice. If it was a peeping Tom, well, it had to come down, with prejudice. When my brother and I visited not long after, she showed us where it was. We tore it down and literally wrapped it around a couple trees. Bent the fucker to complete uselessness. I got an angry call the next day. Did you tear down a hunting stand yesterday? Fuck yeah, I did. That was your uncle's. Her mother's brother. Turns out my cousin reported it to the family and they ignored the issue. When the uncle was asked, he said there was just an old tree house out there. Even when he was exposed, they didn't really care. They were more upset about the damage we did. Suffice it to say, I have written off most of that side of the family. I remember one kid in my classroom that stunk. His clothes were always ratty, and everyone laughed at him and ostracized him. He was a big kid and despite his size he never acted out except once in the middle of class when a teacher told him, in front of everyone, that he needed to shower. It wasn't until I was an adult that I found out how neglected he had been. I try to tell my kids to be nice to anyone who is different. We don't know what their story is, and differences are what make us unique. This wasn't just a stinky kid. It was a kid raising himself. I found out that the reason why one of my uncles didn't want to go back to Korea when he retired was that he couldn't. He was fearful for political reprisals if he tried to return. Turned out his brother was part of the group that assassinated the Korean president back in 1979 and his own innocence was never proven, so he was in fear of getting arrested if he ever tried to go back. Met a super nice guy at a networking event when I just starting out in tech. He had a ton of connections and was a nice family man. Super rich. Eventually we became friends and he was acting as a mentor figure to me in the industry. Went over to his massive new house, met his family, etc. He had the demeanor and looked like Al Borland from Home Improvement, to give you an idea. Like 4 years later I was looking at the sex offender registry map for my local area while I was shopping for houses. Lo and behold, his house popped up. In the early 2000s he was convicted of co-running a commercial child porn sales site. Served 5 years for it in federal prison. My former church youth pastor was raping an acquaintance of mine for years and inadvertently caused his death. I met this boy and the youth pastor when I was in middle school. The boy was gay and it was pretty well known. He was not a regular member of the church, just occasional teen group activities. The first time I ever met the youth pastor, I asked a friend if he was gay. They told me I was crazy. Well, I wasn't. This man was beloved by everyone, and I mean loved. He was the youth leader for over a decade. The last time I ever saw the boy, we were about 16. I ran into him at a store. He told me what had been happening all these years and that he was finally strong enough to expose him. He told me that either he was going to make the youth pastor confess to the church or he would go to the police. As far as I know, he followed through with this confrontation because the very next week, the head pastor announced to the church that our youth pastor was quitting, moving back to his home state to go work at the grocery store he used to work at. Yes, a freaking grocery store. They threw him a farewell party. I never saw the boy again, but I do know he didn't get justice because the youth pastor did exactly what he told the church he was going to do. The boy went into a tailspin, as his cousin told me years later, was depressed and got hooked on drugs. He overdosed when we were 19. I have lived with this for years and kick myself for not saying something too. I don't know if I can now. If anyone thinks I can and something will be done, I do know where that youth pastor is now. After my husband died in 2020, I found out he had been having an affair with a 30-year-old, he was 55, she apparently aborted his baby, everything he told me about his prior life was a lie, second marriage for both of us, and he had been having sex with men since he was in his early 20s. To sum it up, I didn't know this man at all. We had been together 10 years and married for 6. I wasn't close to this person, but I did hang out with them a few times. The best man at my wedding had another really close friend who turned out to be a serial killer. It messed him up really badly. He already had mental health issues and this sent him over the edge. I can't even talk to him anymore. I miss you, man. When I was young, I had vague ideas about my uncle being dodgy. In that, at family events such as weddings etc., my parents would tell me and some of my cousins to stay away from him. When I was in year 8, we were doing a lesson in citizenship class where we had to cut out pieces from a newspaper, no idea why, and I came across an article saying he'd been recommitted to Broadmoor Prison. Went home and Googled him and found out he'd been in prison in the 80s for kidnapping and raping someone, and had been in and out of prison since for other offenses. He also tried to sue the Sun once for defamation since they printed something incorrect about him. He was awarded 1p by the court because it technically was defamation, but it was agreed that what they had printed couldn't have damaged his reputation any further. All I know is that he was in a halfway house for a long time, however from what I've gathered he was released around 5 years ago. One night as a kid I heard my parents having an explosive argument in their bedroom which suddenly went quiet, the door was closed and locked. I found out during a drunk phone call from my mother it was because she attempted to shoot my father in the face with a .303 but it didn't go off when she pulled the trigger as there were no bullets. They were both horrified and just stared at each other apparently. They're still together. My brother was stealing money from father who had dementia. This went on for a year and I found out about it was because the bank who had my father's mortgage called me wondering why it hadn't been paid in 6 months. My father's bank account went into the negative around this time too, and when I confronted my brother about it he said, "Well, I gotta pay my bills." I was about to take control of all the accounts and make sure shit got back on track, but my father ended up in the hospital and died shortly after that. My brother also stole some of my inheritance too. In the end, he stole over $5,000 from his dying father. Graduated boot camp and wondered why my brother wouldn't talk to me. Turns out he was fucking my ex while I was there instead of delivering my letters. Guess guilt ate him up and he thought it was simpler to keep up the lie and not have a brother. Right up until an old friend from my hometown told me what happened. Cousin who played Santa at the family Christmas gathering was arrested for child pornography. Police report said the Gardens officers were disturbed due to the young age of the subjects in the video. After reading parts of his charts that were released to the public, he's not coming near anyone in the family again. Thought I might see him at our grandma's funeral last month, but very glad I didn't. So my grandmother, who's been estranged from my family for a long time now for a multitude of reasons, has this weird thing where she has to share food with people. Are you ordering steak at the restaurant? Well, oh boy, she's gotta order the same thing even if she doesn't like steak. Try her drink, it's really good. Take the first bite of chicken to let her know if it's any good. This always really annoyed me cause I hate sharing food. One day I brought it up to my mom and she was like, "Oh yeah, Grandma is afraid of being poisoned, so she wants other people to try it first." So let me get this straight, Grandma thinks someone is trying to poison her, so she has me try the food first. And it makes so much sense looking back, because she literally would not take a bite of anything she ordered until someone else had a bite first. Thanks, Grandma. My grandfather beat someone to death. My dad was an only child, but my grandmother was once pregnant with my dad's younger brother. When she was 6 months pregnant, someone in construction equipment ran over the car she was driving and she lost the baby. While she was in the hospital, my grandfather found the guy and beat him to death. From what I understand, he was in jail for about a week before he was released. Apparently, he claimed temporary insanity due to the circumstances. I learned all this about 4 years ago when my brother was researching family history and asked my grandfather about it. I've always seen him as a nice, little old man. We've reached the end of the video once again. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to get notified whenever my next video drops, make sure to subscribe. I'm posting once or twice a week. Also, let me know your thoughts on the stories. Until next time.